ACWS has a tradition of doing our land acknowledgement before we start any of our public events, so I will start with our acknowledgement. ACWS acknowledges the traditional lands upon which we live, work, and play. We recognize that all Albertans are treaty people and have a responsibility to understand our history so that we can learn from the past, be aware of the present, and create a just and caring future. ACWS celebrates and values the resiliency, the successes, and the teachings that Indigenous people have shown us, as well as the unique contributions of every Albertan. As you know, we're located here on Treaty 6 land in Ameswaskahikan, which is the traditional territory of the Plains Cree and an ancient gathering place of many Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. These lands have been home to and a central trading place of the Blackfoot, Nakota, Assiniboine, Dene, and the Métis people of Western Canada. We honor the courage and strength of Indigenous women. We honor them as life givers and caregivers as we honor and learn from their continuing achievements, their consistent strength, and their remarkable endurance. Our members serve all nations and all peoples. They are located on Treaties 4, 6, 7, and 8 lands across the province, which also include the 6 Métis regions of Alberta. As you know, the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters is a provincial organization of domestic violence shelters and senior shelters all across this province. We bring now almost 4 decades. Next month we'll be having, or April, we'll be marking 40 years of service, and we serve 39 members who operate 50 shelters across the province for those facing domestic violence and abuse. We work with our members to advocate for them, and we work with them to end domestic violence and abuse through culture-shifting violence prevention programs, collective data and research, and frontline training. ACWS supports Alberta shelters in delivering the essential services which provide safety, support, and improve communities. So I know you haven't missed them, but if you look behind me, you'll see hundreds of hearts. And these hearts were made by members of the public, by school children all across the province to show their support for local domestic violence shelters and for the women, children, and seniors that are within them. This is in fact a small number of hearts that were created as part of our Love a Shelter campaign. There are many more in Alberta shelters themselves, and the hearts demonstrate how much the communities value the work that shelters do. Each heart represents the labor of love that domestic violence shelters undertake to support those fleeing violence and abuse, and how the community supports those who have taken the courageous steps towards violence-free lives. But domestic violence shelters across the province are struggling now. Shelters provide essential services to thousands of vulnerable Albertans every year, and the demand for shelter services is only growing. In the face of that need, shelters are being told again to find a path forward alone. Today, we've released a new report, Shelters Deserve Better, Survivors Deserve Better, Alberta Deserves Better, our 2021-2022 workforce survey that paints a grim picture of the state of domestic violence shelters in the province of Alberta. We need the government of Alberta to take this to heart and make a difference. Domestic violence shelters have not received a funding increase from the government of Alberta in 8 years. As inflation rises and we know a recession is looming, shelters are being asked to operate on budgets written in 2015 dollars. And it has to be said too that those 2015 dollars were insufficient even then. It's unfair to demand shelters operate under these impossible conditions. And the last thing any of us wants is to hamper the efforts of survivors and their children to live violence-free lives. Despite promises that shelters would receive multi-year contracts and greater flexibility on how dollars are allocated, shelters continue to be asked to do more and more with less and less. After the government of Alberta announced a $13 billion surplus in 2022, it's unacceptable that shelters remain with this funding crisis. Stagnant funding hurts survivors of violence, shelters and their staff, and all Albertans who bear the social and economic costs of gender-based violence. ACWS and our members recognize the need for a skilled, well-supported workforce to effectively serve the needs of those fleeing domestic violence and abuse. Together, we have administered 7 surveys on shelter operations, funding, staff compensation, and working conditions across Alberta shelters since 2002. This is our 8th survey. Domestic violence and abuse survivors need highly specialized support from organizations that have been designed for them and from service providers who have been educated to meet their needs. For those survivors who do experience a high risk of serious and imminent harm, receiving support from a domestic violence shelter can literally mean the difference between life and death. The work domestic violence shelters do is crucial, integral, and necessary for the functioning of a healthy Alberta and for the safety and well-being of Albertans fleeing violence. In the words of one survivor coming to shelter, the shelter was the greatest thing that could ever have happened to me. They help each and every one of us to get our self-esteem back and teach us how to start over. But as shelters do their very best to serve Albertans, they are also struggling to meet the increasing demand for services, and their work is being hampered by systemic workforce challenges that negatively impact the well-being of the shelters themselves, the staff they employ, and the survivors they support. In the past year, shelters have seen increasing numbers of survivors reaching out for help and increasingly severe and complex cases. They are navigating this surge in demand in the midst of record-breaking inflation, all-time highs in staff burnout and turnover rates, and stagnant government funding. The government of Alberta has not increased funding for wages in 9 years and operational funding in 8. All told, the total amount of government provides to domestic violence shelters has only increased by 5% since 2015-16, and this funding has partially supported additional shelter spaces across the province, but in no way matches the demand for shelters, nor has it kept pace with the rising costs of living. The only exception to stagnant funding was the provincial and federal relief dollars that came to shelters as an essential service during the pandemic. But even then, the government of Alberta required that shelters return any unspent funding rather than allowing them to keep those funds as part of their pandemic recovery. So we're saying shelters deserve better, survivors deserve better, Alberta deserves better. Our report, available on our website, details the systemic workforce challenges shelters are navigating, and it tells the story of brave and dedicated people who continue to work on behalf of survivors in face of these tremendous obstacles. The average wage of domestic violence shelter staff is now 15% lower than the wage of an average Albertan. It is 21% lower than comparable business sector wages and 33% lower than comparable government wages. And low wages mean it's harder to attract and retain staff. In 21-22, the shelter staff turnover rate in domestic violence shelters reached 45%. This is unprecedented in terms of our sector, and is 18% higher than the national staff turnover average for shelters. Research estimates that it costs between 30 and 150% of a staff member's annual salary to replace them once they've left the position. And based on this estimate in 2021-22 alone, it cost member shelters more than $2.25 million to fill vacant positions. More than 1/3 of shelter staff report that they work an additional job, and almost all of them, 92%, work that additional job to supplement their income. Domestic violence shelters cannot continue to provide maximally effective support to survivors without the ability to recruit and retain their staff. A cost of living adjustment from 2015 funding levels would cost the government of Alberta approximately $10.3 million. The government has already committed $12.9 million in additional funding to the Office of the Chief Firearms Officer beyond the annual funding already received by that office for the purpose of speeding up the process of buying and transferring firearms. By comparison, the government has increased domestic violence shelters only by $2 million since 2016 to fund additional spaces. Yet we still have unfunded shelters and unfunded beds. And the per diem rates for on-reserve shelters has not increased either. So if Alberta could invest $12.9 million in facilitating speedy gun sales, surely they can afford to invest $10.3 million in protecting survivors of abuse and gender-based violence. ACWS calls upon the Government of Alberta to immediately increase shelter funding to accommodate inflation since the last adjustment. As inflation continues to rise, shelter's buying power, like that for the rest of us, continues to shrink. We also call upon the government to work with us to modernize shelter standards, update the shelter staffing model, and review operational funding. Women's and senior shelters across the province deserve a realistic funding model. Alberta, it's time to show love to domestic violence shelters and the survivors they support. It's time to show up for shelters as shelters show up for survivors and help ensure that every shelter who reaches out receives the care that they need. Thank you. And pleased to answer any questions.
So that 10.3 million, is that sort of the minimum?
Yeah. If that would give the inflationary adjustment. I think it's inflation, since we calculated that's also increased, right? So this is the thing about this rolling target with inflation, and we're asking government just to help shelters keep pace with the inflationary pressures. But yeah, the 10.3, I think we calculated that even back in December maybe, I think we calculated back.
Does that include some of the labor issues, or is the labor issues separate?
No, that would include the inflationary adjustments for shelter staff, as well as the operational costs, like food, insurance, all the kinds of things that they have to pay.
Has there been communication with the government about the issue?
Yes, we've asked to meet with the minister. We've asked to meet with the premier. We've provided information to the province as well, going back, I think, to last December, because we commissioned an HR consultant to really look at that, and I think we provided that information shortly before Christmas.
And any response?
We're waiting.
Is there, a breaking point for domestic shelters?
Well, I think there's many of those who are working in, the field of violence against women that are really feeling the pressure, and we've got to address it. I mean, shelters continue to do more and more with less and less. When you answer that phone and you have a woman on the other end seeking help, you're going to help them. But as we're losing expertise in the sector because people can't continue, that adds to our costs and the challenges of providing the best possible service.
Maybe same sort of question, but without that 10 million, what happens? What's next?
Well, I think we continue to see recruitment challenges, retention challenges, and challenges in meeting the need that's out there. Our need is increasing, it's not decreasing, so we need this support.
I'm just going to ask too about numbers. You talked about the women that have been supported through the shelters. Can you maybe also put in perspective how many have had to have been turned away because of the lack of funding?
Yeah, well, they really had to. Olivia, you're going to have to help me with those numbers, or Miranda. But they receive calls for service, and shelters are turning away far too many women because of that. Our capacity for women's shelters hasn't increased substantially for many years, but the need has. And for those women who can't access shelters, of course, shelters are going to reach out to help them the best they can. But if the services aren't there, the accommodation isn't there. I mean, we're seeing multiple barriers right now. There's low-income support. There's lack of access to housing. There's, so it just sometimes creates that bottleneck. But Miranda and or Olivia can give you those numbers.
Jen, you said 45% turnover rate. That was just 2022?
Yep.
Right? That's almost half
Yep.
of staff working in shelters have left.
Yep.
Why?
And we're losing our staff. So those shelters that are able to provide higher wages are certainly able to retain them through fundraising, but we also know how challenging fundraising is these days. So yes, we're seeing a substantive turnover of staff, and we need a strategy to address that, because people can't go to school and learn how to be a domestic violence shelter worker. It takes on-the-job training. We try at ACWS to provide as much of that support and training. So when they leave, while they may take that, because a lot of them leave for government, they may take that with them, but still it means starting all over again and providing that training. Even if you graduate in Alberta as a social worker or a psychologist, you may not necessarily have taken one course in domestic violence. So that on-the-job training and that support for our members is vital.
I know you've mentioned some of the reasons why. Can you summarize for us why do you think almost half your staff have left?
Well, we know it's low wages, it's shift work, it's long hours, it's the stress that they're feeling, and I think the need for the support. But most shelter directors tell us they leave for the provincial government because the wages and the benefits are far greater. The shelters themselves under the provincial government contracts aren't allowed to pay for anything other than the very basic legislated requirements for benefits. So health benefits, dental benefits, all that kind of thing have to be fundraised for as well.
Can you speak to the demand you're seeing at shelters, the increase in calls for service?
Yes, well, we've been seeing that when we do our next release with respect to the demand for service. There's no question, I think, that we're going to see increases in that demand. We know that after a pandemic, after any kind of natural disaster, you have 2, 3, maybe 4 years of increases in that demand. So we are anticipating that as well.
So definitely not slowing down anytime soon.
No, it's not. It's getting, there is a strong demand. And I think the more we try to bring awareness to the issue as well, we have to make sure that the support is there. So recently, for instance, the province announced that they were providing additional funding for the helpline, but you need the help that's there. So when women do call, they can get there, so that we really do need to invest in the expertise and the support that shelters are providing, and we need it sooner, not later.
If this has been an ongoing sort of issue, I mean, no increase since 2015-16, why just sort of sound the alarm now? Why not have gone, or have you?
We have. We've raised this issue at the last election in terms of that, and I think the commitment was we wouldn't be cut. But there was no increase. When we had the last increase, it was an increase, and it did show the impact when we got outreach workers, as an example, added to shelters, and how that also reduced the number of calls because they had a regular worker. They could call on an outreach basis after they left the shelter. So we have been able as well to show that, demonstrate that impact. This is not new, and sometimes we feel like a broken record, actually, but I think it's becoming more severe because of the lag in time.
And the workforce issue is something we're hearing across the social sector as well.
Yeah.
Do you think the government has enough money to fund all social sectors for the working?
Yeah, I mean, years ago, I think under Alison Redford and David Hancock, there was the Workforce Alliance, and then we had 5% increase for all of the sectors serving vulnerable Albertans over 3 years, which really did help to make a difference. So that was really the last funding increase in terms of salaries, and a commitment to really realistically look at that. But I mean, Alberta fell into hard times. The price of oil fell. People weren't getting wages increases. You were just trying to hold your own. There's been the pandemic and navigating through that. So we've seen so many barriers, which I think has really tamped up for everyone. That's serving vulnerable Albertans, significant pressure on the workforce, on the salaries, and that they're able to provide, and they haven't been, adequately compensated the way they should be for the very important work they do.
Is it a slap in the face when you see that money going to the firearms office? And I guess, what does that say about the government's priorities?
Well, it is a priority, right? And we know, and we've met with the new licensing provisions, and they do see the connection between making sure that that there's appropriate vetting around those who may be using firearms as part of their abuse, and so we appreciate that piece and that understanding of that. But I mean, if it could be done for one part of government, and it's not just that, we've seen increases in from management to government, legal aid, lawyers, etc. So it's not that there is the capacity to do it, it's that it needs to be done for many Albertans who are working to serve those who are vulnerable, and in particular, we really want to see that for women's shelters.
So just to be clear, you requested to meet with the province December, still haven't heard anything?
Well, we met at October, actually, when everybody got right. We asked to see everybody and brief them because we recognized it was a new government. We did have a visit from a policy advisor that was looking at the recovery aspect on addictions and mental health, but we've yet to have a meeting.
But for women picking up the phone and calling the helpline, someone will answer. It's just you're not sure what supports will be there.
Well, shelters will always do everything possible to meet the needs of survivors. We've just got to do what we can now to meet the needs of shelter staff as well, and make sure that they're adequately compensated so we don't see our sector bleeding away.
And in terms of capacity, I feel like there hasn't been a new shelter. When there was the latest new shelter, it was the first in a really long time. So there hasn't been.
Well, there's been a couple that have been opened. Rocky Mountain House has increased. There was a 10-year pause by the federal government in terms of building new shelters in Alberta, and so recently we have seen an increase in the number of spaces outside of Edmonton and Calgary predominantly, though I think Calgary's now got a project underway for additional shelter spaces. But it's not in keeping with the demands that's there, and it's also how do you find the operating dollars once you open it, right? So the federal program, which is now, we're hoping it'll be reannounced in the federal budget, provided for 3 years of operational funding after the shelter opened, but we don't know if that will continue. And the funding of women's shelters is also a provincial responsibility.
And the funding you're looking for, that's the 10.3 million, that would be a sustained increase, not one-time funding?
Well, we would want to see it then geared to inflation after that, right? So let's do the catch-up with the lack of because we haven't had those inflationary adjustments. And then let's sit down and really look at realistically what does it take to run a women's shelter, looking to the future, not going back to guidelines that were established in the last century. So we really do want to work with the province to look at a good funding model that looks at the needs of community, a recognition of the differences between rural and urban demands. We want to do all of that. We called for a turnaway strategy as part of our last election campaign. Let's really work together to see how we can figure this out. But also, I appreciate that with the pandemic, lots of things we hoped would happen didn't happen.
Jen, I'm just doing some quick math. So if you're asking for $10 million spread amongst 50 shelters, it's not a lot of money for each shelter.
No, Yeah.
$200,000.
Well, they don't get a lot, right? Yeah.
But that money would make a huge difference.
Yeah, it would make a huge difference for them to do that. And as I say, that was calculated a few months back. So, as we wanted a real inflationary adjustment, not always having to look back and always be behind.
Can you just talk about the emotional toll of, the people answering the phones knowing that they don't have a bed available or they don't have all the resources they would like, how challenging that is?
Yeah, I think it is really challenging. I think it's challenging for the woman who calls and is asking for support, and it may have been the first time they've called. So shelters recognize that is, an important piece of really working to support them and trying to find what options might be available should they not be able to admit her to shelter, or helping her in a safety planning until she's able to. But I mean, it's a crushing responsibility to be there answering the phone and realizing that your shelter doesn't have space today.
I have a lot of questions from our online team, but I don't want to keep everyone here.
Yeah, I think just the other thing to really point out too is that, shelters will do all they can to support women, and it's also important to get that message out there. We don't want to ever deter women from calling, that please reach out and get the support that you need. The hearts show that the community is behind them in meeting that need. So we're also asking the community to voice their concerns around shelter funding. And as we move forward to really, put front and center the needs of survivors all across Alberta, rural, urban, and on reserve, and no matter what their age or background.
What minister do you want Albertans to contact?
Sorry?
What minister are you asking Albertans to contact?
Well, Minister Dixon has the responsibility for shelters. It's in his bailiwick. But there's also the National Action Plan to end violence against women and girls, and so the province is also getting funding from that we also want to work with them on, and that would be Minister Luan and Parliamentary Secretary Tanya Furr.
Sarah, if you want to keep going,
Want me to keep going? That's
I'm
okay?
just gonna get shots of hearts and.
So these are going to be a little bit more detailed then. Can you break down how shelters get their funding? You said it's a combination of federal and provincial dollars?
Well, during the pandemic, the federal government provided funding through Women's Shelters Canada. So that was a really great rollout to help them through the pandemic. And the province provided funding as well for the pandemic. By and large, though, most of the funding is from the provincial government, except for a number of shelters who get no funding at all, and have recently opened. NISA Homes might be an example of that here in Edmonton and in Calgary. And then there's also shelters, even ones that have been around a very long time, like in Camrose, who have unfunded beds. And then we have shelters that have added beds because they've seen the need, but are now telling us they don't know if they can fundraise to keep those beds open. So the province is primarily responsible for most shelters. The feds are primarily responsible for on-reserve shelters, but the province also provides a per diem rate. It gets really complicated for women who are normally resident off reserve that come to a non-reserve shelter. But shelters are cobbling together different grants and different funding, and you'll see this in the report. So they'll apply for federal and provincial grants from other sources, but then that takes resources and administration and more reports and all of that to provide the supports that they need.
You mentioned fundraising has just been hard in general lately.
Yeah. I think, well, we're seeing this all across the country, but people are recovering from the pandemic. There aren't the same types of funding that may be available, and fundraising is generally down.
Can you talk a bit more about the Love a Shelter campaign?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is really, again, reach out to schools and community to talk about the work that shelters do and what it means to them. And so different schools across the province worked and did their Valentines. So if you could visit, oh dear, they're falling down now. So they sent their Valentines into the shelters to just show them the support that they have for women's shelters and for the women and children that are in shelter, to show them that the community is behind them. So we had great uptake. I think this is our first year trying it, and it was good to see, both the coverage that the media provided, but also the support that came from the community.
Can you talk about some of the messages that may have come through that, or some of the reactions from some of the folks in shelter?
Olivia, do you want to take that one, or can you?
Well, yeah, some of the messages are actually behind you on the wall there, and you can just see notes, from kids that have passed on messages of support and care for the survivors, and also just getting the message out about prevention too, I think, because a lot of people don't realize that the shelters do a lot of outreach prevention work with kids to begin with, to really give them good ideas about healthy relationships and what healthy relationships look like. So that was a big part of it too.
And can people still partake in that, or is it done now?
It was sort of a Valentine's Day focused campaign. So yeah, they do work in schools all year round, and community all year round.
Anyone wants to send a letter of support to shelters, I think they would love that.
And this last one, sorry, I have to read to you, it's a little complicated. Can you tell us about the online training program for people who work with kids who may have been exposed to domestic violence?
Yes, we developed a program called the Healing Brain. It's an online through a learning management system. It's a number of modules that look at practical interventions for children who are working, or for people who are working with children who've been exposed to domestic violence. And so it was developed primarily for our members and through the strong support of the IODE Alberta chapter. And it was recently launched. I think we've had several hundred who've already taken that course, and so it shows that there's a need out there to understand it. Shelters have really pioneered in many ways around looking at the impact of domestic violence on children. And I think actually Edmonton Women's Shelters here in Edmonton was the first to ever even do a report on what they were seeing about the impact of children, long before we started looking at the architecture of the brain and brain science and all of that. Shelters were seeing how this manifested itself right in shelter, and how important it was to have a good bond between mom and child and work on that to build that child's resiliency. So that course is available. We're very proud of it. We've also incorporated in it the calls to action, so that we're also very mindful of the calls to action and the impact on Indigenous children in particular, and how to incorporate that into the learning that we have in the Healing Brain.
The last question, how hopeful are you, knowing an election is looming, that you will actually get this money in a timely fashion?
Well, hope springs eternal, I think. I mean, it's a wonderful way to honor both 40 years of service that shelters have been providing, if not more, and also addressing a problem that, if you don't address it, costs everyone. Human costs, the financial costs are far greater if you don't intervene and provide those support. Just to give you an example, thanks to the City of Edmonton, we had some funding for nurses and mental health supports. And in 1 year alone, the number of visits that were prevented to go to the emergency room because a nurse was available, the number of relapse recovery programs for those who were dealing with addictions and mental health issues, really helps to demonstrate that when you invest in shelters and you provide that front line, so you benefit in so many different ways.